Ash still rose in soft spirals when Sansa walked the broken floor of the Red Keep. Wind pushed through shattered windows and made the torn banners breathe. The Blackwater caught the afternoon light beyond the ruined ramparts, a long stripe of hammered silver, and the crows that had come to the city after the fires were thick on the burned stones of the courtyards. She had never loved this place, not the sight of it, not the memory of it. Yet the day had come when the men and women of 7 battered kingdoms would look to its halls to hear how they were to live. Jon stood waiting for her beneath a throne that did not exist. The iron chair had been melted into a dark puddle on the floor, its wicked metal teeth slumping like a slain beast. He had refused another throne. The carpenters had brought plans, and the smiths had spoken through ruined teeth about gold and oak, and masons had made little models with clay and sticks. He had waved them all away. "Not now," he had said. "Not ever, if I can help it." Now he wore neither crown nor sword belt. His hair was bound back, his face unshaven, his black leather scoured. Ghost sat at his heel, a smear of white in the dusty hall, red eyes watchful. The company that had followed Jon inside had gone quiet when Sansa entered. Davos Seaworth, in a sea-gray doublet patched at the elbow. Brienne of Tarth in immaculate plate, a sword at her hip and the white of the Kingsguard bright at her shoulder. Tyrion Lannister stood to one side with his hands bound loosely in front of him, more for the appeasement of those who hated the sight of him than any true need. He wore the face of a man who had already argued himself hoarse and would do it again if called upon. Samwell Tarly, round and earnest, clutched a parchment case under one arm as if it were a shield. Sansa crossed the wide space between columns. She had chosen gray wool and white fur, the colors of their house, but a crimson ribbon bound her sleeves at the wrist. In King's Landing, you learned quickly that color mattered. She went to Jon and kissed his cheek. His skin was cold. He smelled of smoke and the road. "We're ready," she said. He nodded once. They had spoken in the long night hours, doors barred, voices low, ghostly, as if afraid to wake a tyrant's memory. The city below them was a maze of torches. The gates were open. The bells in their broken towers were silent. The lords and ladies gathered where the throne had cracked and bled across the floor, where light spilled through a hole in the roof and turned the dust into gilt motes. Robin Arryn, taller than Sansa remembered, thin as a reed, with Jon Royce solid beside him like a living dolmen. Edmure Tully, who had slept in his boots because he still had not learned that wars end even if men do not. Gendry Baratheon, uncomfortable in clothes that called themselves noble, each seam a fresh bruise. He kept reaching for a hammer that was not on his hip. The new Prince of Dorne, a man with olive skin, hair braided with gold rings, his eyes as still as a cold river, stood with his counselors and said nothing. Yara Greyjoy wore leather and salt. Bronn of the Blackwater did not pretend to nobility. He stood as if he owned boredom and leaned into it like a man with a good mattress. There were others. Small lords from the Reach still smelling of wine and crushed herbs. Westerland's men with gold lions without a queen to polish them. A thin-lipped Braavosi from the Iron Bank whose name Sansa could not hold in her head no matter how often he offered it. Jon's voice scratched as if the smoke had been caught behind his teeth. "It isn't a day for crowns." The hall answered him with a murmur, a restless animal shifting its weight. He looked as if he would rather have been standing in snow with the wind knifing his cheeks, but he did not look away. "You came because you've lost and you've bled and you've survived it. If you think I have a plan to make all your wrongs right, I don't. But I won't be your tyrant. I won't be your god. I'll be a man you can require to keep his word." He turned to Sansa, held up a circlet of plain worked silver, and she felt an old cold move along her spine, like hands. He had taken it from a goldsmith who had made it silently, refusing the red enamel that others had suggested, refusing little lions or stags or dragons. The metal had cool weight. "While I ride the realm," Jon said, "to ask for oaths and give mine, to see what's left and what we can make of it. The realm needs a hand to steer the rudder. I name Sansa Stark of House Stark, my regent in King's Landing and the Crownlands, to govern justly in my stead, under my seal, until I call an end to the regency. She has lived as a hostage here. She knows the walls and the knives. She knows what it is to walk afraid and still keep walking. He put the circlet on her brow. Wind moved the fur at her shoulders as if Winterfell itself had breathed. For a heartbeat she felt the touch of that long hall to the north. Stone kept warm by bodies, the smell of wood smoke and bread, the soft drag of Arya's boots on flagstones, Bran's old laugh when he could still run. This hall smelled of iron and ash. The circlet was only a ring of metal. A regent's power was only words, and words cut when steel could not. Sansa inclined her head. When she straightened, she found the eyes in the room and gave each a heartbeat, as father had taught them and mother had done by nature. "If you hoped for a liar," she said evenly, "I am a poor choice. If you hoped for a fool, poorer still. If you hoped for someone who would trust you because you smile, I am very sorry to disappoint you." There were a few quiet laughs. Bronn's mouth tilted. Tyrion's eyes softened with relief, as if she had spoke the first sentence of an argument he had prepared. "We all want the same thing," Sansa said. "To wake in the morning and know the world will not tilt on its axis, to sit down at a table with bread on it and children laughing. We can have that if we're cruel in the right places and kind in the others. Bring me your quarrels." She lifted her chin and let her gaze rest briefly on the Braavosi, then on the Dornish prince, then on Bronn, who smirked. He had heard the threat in "Bring me your quarrels" and liked it. "Bring me your claims. Bring me proof. Bring me plans. I'll sit in judgment when I must and in council when I can. And I will keep accounts. I will keep accounts so carefully that the ink will bleed into the grain." When the hall released its breath, the sound climbed up into broken rafters and hung there like old smoke. Davos, blunt hands out of his sleeves, said, "Your Graces," almost absently, and smiled because it felt right to give them back a language that wasn't a prayer or a plea. Later, when the light had gone lower and the torches drew their own little worlds around the pillars, Sansa and Jon stood together, alone, and looked at the puddle of iron that had been a throne. Ghost had gone near it, sniffed, sneezed. "You could still change your mind," Sansa said, not because she believed it. Jon's mind was a door that, once closed, turned into a wall, but because some words must be spoken aloud so that both can hear them die. "I could," he said. "I won't. I can't sit. If I sit, I turn into something else. Better to be moving. I'll be a better king in the saddle." We used to say the same thing about the Lord Commander, remember? It wasn't meant to be a joke. "You mean to be a man in rooms," she said softly, "and not a symbol." "I mean to look them in the eyes when I ask for their oaths," he said. "And I mean to see which hands are clean and which aren't. If I bleed for them, they can bleed honesty for me." Sansa's smile was brief and sharp. "Very northerly of you. Is that scorn?" "That's approval disguised as scorn, so that you don't become unbearable." He laughed, a small sound like a piece of slate breaking. It startled both of them. He reached and brushed a fallen strand of hair from her temple. The tenderness was quick and wordless. "You'll have Tyrion. He's yours," she said. "He always was. He loves the game and the grief of it. I will use him. It's what he wants. You'll have Sam. I'll have Sam. And Brienne. And Davos when he's in harbor. And that Sellsword who won a castle he didn't ask to keep." Her eyes moved without her will toward Bronn, who was laughing at some joke Yara had tossed him across a table like a fish. "He has something many high lords don't. He knows how to count, and he knows how to want." Jon hummed assent. "You'll have reminders, letters. When you're cold and tired of this place, I'll send you a story about a fool in the Stormlands or a stubborn Ironborn, and you can laugh." "I will," she said, and didn't add "if you live or if I do." They both understood that the wind shifts. That was what had made them the last Starks left at any table. In the morning, he left with a retinue that did not gleam. He refused the polished parade a city bleeding needed. He took Davos, who could talk to shipwrights and fishermen. He took Brienne, who could look at a man as if he were a page in a book and read him. He took Sam, although Sam insisted he ought to remain to order the ravens and set the records in place, and Jon said quietly, "I need eyes that see kindness," and Sam came. He took a handful of picked guards from the north and the Stormlands, men who would not hesitate when told to go into a ditch to pull out a child. He did not take Tyrion, and Tyrion said, "You've learned one thing from me then about how something looks," and grinned because it stung and he preferred that. Arya found Sansa on the rampart at sunrise, the city pale below, the gulls flying crooked lines. She came up like a shadow and put an arm around Sansa's waist and rested her head against Sansa's shoulder, as if she were still small and tired after lessons. For a moment Sansa breathed in the smell of salt and steel and horse and thought that home could be this. A red-haired girl with a hidden knife, a city trying to forget its scars. "He'll be all right," Arya said. "No," Sansa said. "He'll be Jon, but he won't be foolish." Arya snorted. "He can't help being foolish. He has a moral bone in him that keeps breaking and healing wrong." "Don't go," Sansa said suddenly, the ribs of her mouth making the words hurt. "Not yet. Wait, you can teach men to die of panic or to die smaller later. Wait a moon." "I am waiting," Arya said. "For a moon. For a tide. Then I'm going." She did not look at Sansa. "There's more world than this one, and someone should find it without wanting to burn it." Sansa nodded. The gull cried. The city went about the cruel business of surviving. Jon's progress to the Stormlands traveled roads that had been crushed by 1,000,000 feet fleeing and 1,000,000 returning. The burnt fields had already sprouted green like hair after a fever. When the rain swept in off Shipbreaker Bay, it came as if it had learned arrogance from kings. The men rode with their heads down and their cloaks slapping. Ghost trotted ahead, untroubled. He shook himself afterwards and the water went flying like silver dogs. Storm's End rose out of the weather like a bad-tempered god. Gendry waited in the great round yard with water running off his brow. He had cleaned his hands but left scars where they were. His clothes were finer than he was used to and too short in the sleeves because he kept working out of them. There were lords at his shoulders, from House Caron, Selmy cousins with too many opinions and no Selmy among them. A pair of bucklers with a taste for other men's coin. A wild who thought lineage an argument that never ended. Gendry came forward and went to one knee as if his joints needed oil. "Your Grace." "Don't," Jon said in a voice that was softer than rain and as final. "I am not your master. I'm here to ask you to be Lord in truth, not because a dead queen said words. Over you while men with spears watched." He took Gendry's arm and raised him. "You have a hammer." He glanced at the great one leaning clean in the corner, the head polished, the handle worked with gold. Gendry grinned, brief and embarrassed, like a boy caught singing. "Sometimes." He stepped back and introduced his people, each with a sentence Jon could hold and weigh. Jon remembered names because he had learned at the wall that a command given without a name attached went floating like fog and did not land anywhere. That night in the dim, circular hall beneath the vaulting that had given shelter to kings, Gendry sat at Jon's right hand and drank too quickly and spoke too frankly, which made men trust him and hate him in the same measure. "I asked her," he said to Jon with a shrug that he meant to turn into humor and failed. "And she said no." "Arya," Jon said, though he knew, "would have made the bards choke," Davos said around a mouthful of salted lamb. "Baratheon and Stark, post and lintel, hammer and, well," he lifted his cup toward Gendry. "You'll have a wife who's not a Stark and still strong in her own head. You'll have to if you plan to last. The Stormlands doesn't like to be told it can't get wet." Jon watched the faces at the lower tables, the servants moving like fish in a current, the lords who had come to test the man without a name wearing a name. He saw the Caron boy peering at a map laid on a bench and knew he would like the boy. He saw Lord Buckler's mouth thin when Gendry spoke about lowering a toll and knew the man would be trouble when he could find an honest reason to defend greed. Brienne ate neatly, said nothing, and watched everyone's hands. The next morning, Jon sat in the seat beneath the painted antlers and heard claims. A fisherman whose old rights had been stripped by a lord whose boat had better ropes. A woman from a village inland where rivers had changed course after the fires and left fields saline and salted like tears. She wanted the petty lord who taxed salt as if it were gold to stop, or at least to explain his logic. He could not. Jon left him his pride and took his tax, and the man went away dazed, surprised to discover that humility did not kill him. He ordered the Stormland's roads to be mended with coin from the great houses and labor from those who would otherwise be idle, not from those who were already hungry. He took a boy of 8 from a father at the end of hope and set him to sweep and run errands in the keep, and the father cried in a way that showed he had not allowed himself to cry in 5 years. When he spoke with Gendry alone in the smithy, because Gendry kept one still, a smaller forge, tucked behind barrels and a stacked rack of horseshoes, Jon said, "You need a wife who's more than a piece on the Syvas board." Gendry grinned. "Is that what Sansa is?" "She's the board," Jon said. "And the table." He hesitated. "There's a Karen girl with sense. Lady Ellen." Gendry pulled a piece of iron from the coals and set it on the anvil. His movements had the unconscious grace of someone for whom force is a language. "There's a boy at her father's elbow who thinks I should be grateful to lick salt from his hand. There's a wild who says I'm not lord enough to change an old law. If I marry one, I make an enemy of the other. If I marry neither, I make enemies of both. If I marry Arya, I make enemies of myself and the girl with the wolf blood who won't be pinned to any map." He lifted the hammer and brought it down. The sound rang through the small room and out into the rain. "I'll marry the one who looks me in the eye and says she wants the work. Then send for Lady Ellen," Jon said, "and a wild and a buckler to witness her answer." He left the Stormlands with oaths that tasted more like bread than wine. Behind him Gendry stood on the sea-wet parapet with the Karen girl and watched a sloop go out through the chop, its sail like a gull's wing. They spoke quietly, and when Gendry laughed, he did it like a man who had decided he did not mind giving some of his power to another person because he knew he had more than he knew what to do with. In King's Landing, Sansa moved into rooms with new doors. She had the masons seal some passages and open others. She kept the kitchens busy, paying not in promises but in coin, and set bakeries in Flea Bottom to turn out coarse loaves 3 times a day, each marked with a stamp of a wolf and a crown stag because men did less damage to a thing they had decided they had some part in designing. She sent men to fetch carts and ran wagons into the crownlands like veins carrying blood. She could feel the city's pulse in the soles of her feet when she crossed the courtyards. She asked Sam to find records for the rubble of guild halls, charters for districts that no longer existed. She knew that law was a thing you could rebuild one beam at a time if you had the old maps. She assembled her council in a room that had not been used for 2 queens. It was long and narrow, with a window that looked out over a courtyard where a tree had broken through the paving stones and made a green claim. Tyrion sat at the far end because distance made him more honest. Brienne near the door because that was where a guard belonged. Bronn took the chair that gave him easy sight of everyone's hands. Davos's chair stayed empty unless a ship he was riding touched the Blackwater. When he did sit, he smelled of pitch and tar and rain. "The Iron Bank sent another letter," Tyrion said, unwinding parchment as if it were a snake. "Polite, insistent, the kind of politeness that is made of very small barbs. Tell them we will pay with timber and grain from the Reach, not gold," Sansa said. "Tell them we will pay with the right to build warehouses on the Blackwater and levy a small tax on what they store. Tell them that if they write polite letters asking for gold, they may receive polite letters in return explaining how very sorry we are that their gold is elsewhere." Bronn huffed. "I could talk to them." "You do," she said. "You will be our voice. But you will keep your hands where I can see them. Regent, if you want warehouses on the Blackwater within a year, you'll have to pull men off the walls," Bronn said cheerfully. "Your masons are already complaining. You'll have to find them apprentices. There aren't enough hands left that know how to hold a plumb line. Find boys who carried spears," Sansa said. "Find girls from kitchens with strong backs. Give them coin and meat and teach them to set stones. Make them swear to their guild masters. Put the guild masters under oath to me. I'll set the wages. Standard wage for every apprentice. A bonus upon completion. Let the guilds argue with my purse if they like. I look forward to it." "Walls," Brienne said. "If walls fail, the rest is hard to enjoy." "Walls matter," Sansa said, "but walls are nothing without the people inside them, and the wolves eat the weakest first." We will not leave any street as ground where the wolves learn to feed. Is that metaphor? Tyrion asked. Or are there actual wolves I should be aware of? Sansa looked at him. Her mouth curved, and it was not unkind. Both, she said. The Prince of Dorne sent word that he would receive Jon at Sunspear in 3 weeks if the seas were kind. Jon's party moved along the coast, stopping at villages where every face turned at the sound of bridal bells because bells had announced dragons not long before. A child with hair like dark wheat reached for Ghost and then thought better of it when the dire wolf turned his head slowly and looked back like a priest considering a confession. Sam coaxed the child with a piece of dried apple and a smile. Children trusted that smile because it is extremely hard to lie with your entire face when you are round as the moon. At Rook's Rest, they slept in a keep that had once belonged to a man who had tried to take a pursed ring from a queen's finger and had been dashed with fire for his trouble. Jon did not sleep long. He sat by a slit window and let the wind grind through the stone into the room like a rasp. He thought of Daenerys when he had not meant to, and he said her name in his head with gentleness and with blame, and the two sounds met and made a chord he could not stand. He felt for a little while as if he had 2 bodies, one human and one made entirely of memory, and he opened his hands and let both of them rest on the window ledge. Sunspear came out of the sea like a knife laid flat. The Martells had chosen to meet in the water gardens where wind moved across long pools and children shouted on the steps with their feet slick with spilled water. The prince walked barefoot, rings on his toes because sand respects no leather. He led them under an arcade where shade smelled alive. "We prefer the terms we had," the prince said, and the soft movement of his fingers made the gold on his wrists answer. "Autonomy, trade. We have little interest in your wars or your gods. I say this in courtesy and truth. We can be friends without pretending to be lovers." "I'm not here to pretend anything," Jon said. "I'm here to see if we can help each other keep our houses from burning down while we sleep." He did not talk about dragons. They had learned that the word was a door that swung wide and let in too much heat. "You want a treaty? We'll write one. We'll carve it into stone if you like." The prince's mouth smiled without the rest of his face. "You came with a regent marked by the winter gods," he said to Davos, to Sam, to Brienne. "You bring people who count and remember. You must consider that charm is something we can buy in the market. But memory is rarer." They went down to the water later and ate fish that had been cooked inside a clay shell and cracked open at the table. Jon thought of Arya because a girl with eyes like hers ran along a lip of stone with a serpent of water spinning from her hand like a whip. A baker who shorted loaves discovered he would not be allowed flour for a week and would stand in the square and explain himself. Men hung from ropes much less than once they had. She would have killed more if she needed to, and they began to understand that only the numbers mattered. She would give a man a rope if he cut 3 throats to fill his purse, but she would not hang him for snatching a heel of bread. She would make him help build storehouses and make him eat the first loaf baked inside as a kind of penance. She dragged wolfishness back a step every day until the city stopped snapping at its own ankles. Tyrion came to her with a folio of names. "Old debts," he said. "The gold cloaks, for one. If you expect them to be loyal, you should know which of their captains have cousins in the Riverlands with pigs that need feeding." "I expect them to be loyal because I will pay them in coin that doesn't bounce," Sansa said, scanning the names. "That's enough. You don't buy men's hearts. You buy their habits." "Cynical," he said. "True," she said with a small smile. "And cheaper." Bronn barged in without knocking because he still did that. "There's a Lannister who wants a word." Sansa's eyes shifted like a sparrow's. "Which one? The one I know or one who wants me to know him?" "Davin," Bronn said. "A cousin with shoulders wide enough to carry a grudge. He brought 6 cousins and 10 times that many men-at-arms. They're camped on the Rose Road and they've sent a sweet little letter, asking for a talk about the future of Casterly Rock. It reads as if he thinks the rock is a ship in harbor and you've taken her anchor and he'd like it back." Tyrion's fingers paused on the arm of his chair. "I wondered when he would come out of whatever hole he picked to hide in. Davin is not an idiot, which I'd almost prefer. He has the Lannister gift for dignity and fury. He'll try to make you give him pardon and permission to grow again." Invite him, Sansa said. Not here. Not inside the city. I will not have Lannister standards in these halls until I know what they carry besides color. There's a manor east of the Rush that still has half a roof. We'll meet in the yard. Bronn's grin showed a wolf's appreciative interest. You like the air when the knives come out as much as the old lion did. No, Sansa said. I like to know where the knives are. He can carry his in. I'll carry mine in my sleeves. We'll see who has the longer reach. Jon crossed the Mander and came to a land that had forgotten how to forgive. The reach lay luminous in the long afternoons, wheat like water and water like green silk. Highgarden rose out of its own shadow, and Bronn put his boots up on the carved bench because no one had ever convinced him to do otherwise. The hall was full of men with perfumed hair who smelled of old coin and new roses. They looked at Bronn like he was an inexplicable animal who had been granted a title by a god with a sense of humor. You're sitting a seat that was a grandmother's before it was a sister's before it was a queen's, one of them said to Bronn in a voice you used for eggshells. Does that not feel like wearing someone else's bones? It feels like sitting on a chair, Bronn said. It's very comfortable. Thank you, Reachmen, for your good taste in chairs. They wanted to talk tithes. They wanted to talk about whether grain should go north to feed a city they had despised and feared and envied all their lives. They wanted to ask Jon if he meant to be another dragon to take their sons and set their daughters to march away from hearths they believed were the point of life. Jon said, "Your children will not be taken for war unless you send them. Your grain will go north because you have too much and they have too little. When your houses burned, whose grain fed you? I want names. I want you to send letters. And then we will write it down that if the Crownlands ever have grain you do not, they will send it to you in return, and not in 20 years either. Do you want to be partners? Or do you want to be remembered as cold-handed men in a summer field? Some of them bent. Some did not. A man called Lord Merryweather, who wore yellow like a challenge, smiled too easily and then too coldly in the space of a sentence. He had a cousin in Old Town with priests in his pocket and spoke of the faith like it could be brought out of a cupboard and used to bless or curse according to plan. A woman of House Redwine sent word that their fleet would go over to the harvest and bring wine for pay instead of coin because wine moves men at half the cost. Bronn listened hard at the edges of the room and then slipped out the door to talk to his own men in the yard, who were long of arm and short of patience and had an ear on every lane. That night a crossbow string rubbed with wax and hatred sang in the dark. The bolt meant for Jon hit the beam because Brienne had shifted her chair without thinking, because she had learned how to stand between one heartbeat and the next. The guards took the shooter, a boy with a freckled face and hands that shook even as he tried to bite them. They paid me, he said. My sister, my little one. It was a purse, not a bag. That's different. Jon knelt in the straw and held the boy's face in both hands. What's your sister's name? Lisa, the boy said, and tried not to sob, because he thought kings killed boys who sobbed. She's got the cough. She can't breathe when it rains. Our roof. Jon closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were not different except in the way of men who have stood in a winter wind too long. The man who hired you, he said, is a coward. He will not come out of his house for your tears. Don't take money from cowards again. It stains you, and it is hard to wash out. He stood, looked at Brienne. Find him. She did. Bronn helped, because he had spent his life around the sort of men who put coin in boys' hands and then waited to see if death would do their work for them. They found the shooter's patron in a room with painted vines and a dog asleep under the table because men who hire murderers of 10 have dogs that do not care. They brought him out and stood him in the courtyard with the moon on his neck and the boy who had shot at Jon standing 6 feet away and trying not to be sick. Jon made the Lord speak the boy's name aloud 3 times, like a charm. Then he took his lands, because oaths and coin are the only 2 things lords believe in. He gave the boy his life and a task. Stay a year at Highgarden and carry water for the kitchens. Then go to the Stormlands and tell Lord Gendry who had paid you to kill a king. Highgarden bent a little more. Old Town sent men with measured eyes and quiet boots. They didn't speak of the Hightowers because the Hightowers preferred to be unspoken of, but they would talk about stone and weight and arches and how to keep water where you wanted it to go when it preferred cliffs. Sam went with them into a small room filled with tiny bones and came out with tears on his face because someone had kept the bones of birds broken by a cat and he had found one that was whole. From there the road went salt and spray. The Iron Islands were a night hammered into the shape of rock. Yara met them on the quay with her hair braided back and her mouth like a straight line of iron. There were men behind her with ropes on their wrists and knives in their belts because the islands liked to keep their contradictions close. "You came," she said to Jon. "I expected you to send me a letter long enough to hang men with." "You'd prefer that," he said. "I'd prefer a world that doesn't make me a liar when I say we're done with reaving," Yara said, and her voice carried to the line of men at her back. "I have told them it is over. I have told them they will get rich with salt fish and slick words and hiring their ships to men with persuadable gold. They tell me I have tried to turn wolves into dogs." Jon looked at the men standing in the salt with seaweed clinging to their boots. He remembered the dead on the ice. He remembered Theon Greyjoy, shaking and stubborn. "Sometimes," Jon said, "dogs bite worse." He sat in the sea-stone chair and felt nothing but the ache of his scar when the weather turned. He set terms. The Ironborn could elect their own, keep their salt rights, run their ships where they liked. They would not reave on the coasts of the Six Kingdoms. If they did, he would come, and they would not like that. He said it very quietly. The quiet made them listen. He listened to them too. He listened to a big man with wrists like old rope talk about how men go mad if the sea is taken from them. He listened to a girl of 15 who said she could swim a mile with a dagger in her teeth. He listened to 3 brothers from House Botley argue about whether iron was better forged by men who had known fear or by men who had only known salt. He listened until they began to regard him as a man who had the patience to hear a whole story. In the end, he had almost as many enemies there as when he arrived, but they whistled at his back in a different tone, and he left Yara standing with her head up. "We'll hold," she said to him, as if she'd tasted something bitter and found it not entirely disgusting. "Because if we don't, you'll come break our teeth and then tell stories about it afterwards." "I don't tell stories," Jon said. "That's what will make your stories better," she said, and clapped his shoulder hard enough to bruise. Letters traveled with ravens and with men who ran better than birds. Sansa's letters were precise things with the scent of burning wax. She did not waste ink on what she knew he could not change with knowledge. She told him who had tried and failed to bribe the captain of the city watch. She told him whose daughter had gotten with child, and how that father had brought her to Sansa with more fear than any lord ever came with. She wrote, "I fed 100 men twice a day from a pot so big a boy can fit inside. I made them stand in line and learn to wait. We're teaching patience as if it were a trade. It might be." He wrote back, "I rode through a wheat field that made me want to lie down and hide. I never understood why the Reach thinks it should be left alone. Now I do. It is so beautiful that it grows its own pride." He wrote, "Davos falls asleep some nights with his boots on purpose because he says it makes waking simpler." He wrote, "Brienne saved my life with the kind of movement you might miss if you blinked." He did not write about the nights when he saw Daenerys standing at the foot of his bed and, behind her, the long shape of a dragon whose breath warmed the air. He knew better than to write ghosts into letters. She did not write about the days when she stood in a ruined room and pictured a queen in green velvet with a lion's mouth and thought, "You taught me how to do this and I hate you for it, and I am using what you taught me and I am not sorry." At the manor east of the Rush, Sansa faced Davin Lannister. He had a lion's breadth of shoulder and a face the color of old stone. He removed his helm himself and set it beneath his arm and bowed exactly as far as he thought she deserved. "Lady Regent," he said. "My lord," she said. They stood in the yard where a chestnut tree cast a scatter of shade, and the flies considered whether they loved salt more or sweat. Brienne stood at Sansa's left, Tyrion to her right on a stool because he preferred to be equal in height to something even if it was furniture. The Lannister retinue was neat, and the edges of their banners did not fray in the wind the way some men's do when their households are not tended. "Casterly Rock is ours by right," Davin said, and it happened that his voice carried the weight of old certainties like a man carries a familiar spear. "Whatever your feelings about past queens, my people are not those people. No one is anyone who came before them," Sansa said. Nevertheless, we live in the world those people made, and so do we. She nodded to Tyrion. He climbed down, went to a sea. Hest set on trestles, lifted a rolled parchment and held it up with his small, precise hands. This, Tyrion said, is a list of those who survived at Casterly Rock when I left it as a place empty of charm and wealth and full of indignities. Most of the servants, some guards, an old maester with a back like a question mark. The officer lists for the men who commanded the levy. If you wish to take up the duties of your house, you will do so by feeding those people first and paying them for their service and maintaining the rock and its lands in good repair. You will send 1/10 of your grain to King's Landing for 5 years as penance for the particular offenses of your late house. You will open your roads to traffic and not charge a coin for any cart that is carrying stone or timber bound for the crownlands. You will not support any claim to bring back the faith in the shape that led to what it led to. You will open the rock's old catacombs to maesters who wish to study the caves. You will not maintain a private army larger than 1,000 men-at-arms until the crown's judges have inspected the rock twice and declared your revenues declared in good faith. Davin stared at him, then at Sansa. You expect me to bend my neck like a debtor? She smiled, small and cutting. You are a debtor, but what I expect is that you will be glad you aren't asked for your head as well. He put his helm on again. When men put their helms on that way in her presence, she was reminded that you can judge the shape of a storm from the way a single gull flies. He said, "The name Lannister doesn't pay tithes for sins committed by other men." "Names pay," Sansa said. "They always have. That's why we give the debt a word and pretend it's not an obligation of flesh." He looked back at his men. It steadied him. "And if I say no? Then you will camp outside the city for a week and watch 100 men eat every morning and every evening," Sansa said. "When you've watched them, you will make up your mind, and if you still say no, you will march west accompanied by a scribe who will write down your path and the names of those who give you bread on the road, and those names will be put in a book in the Red Keep. I cannot make you accept justice. I can make you live with the knowledge of what refusing it costs." He considered the tree and the yard and the woman with the wolf circling her brow. He had expected tears or iron and had gotten neither, only the sort of politeness that knows itself to be a weapon. "1/10, he said. "For 5 years. 7, Sansa said. 6. She looked at him, then at Tyrion. 6. And your judges will come twice in those 6 years, and if they find a fault they will be sorry, and perhaps you will be sorry. We'll see." He bowed again, slightly deeper. It was not victory, and it was not surrender, and it would serve. When he marched away, Tyrion climbed back onto his stool with theatrical care and said, "You're the best thing to happen to the Lannisters since our father died. You are very free with your compliments when they insult your blood," Sansa said. But the corner of her mouth tugged, because he looked like a child who had managed to rob a sweet cellar and get away with it. "You've learned to spend what you're owed," Tyrion said. "That's rarer than learning to spend what you're given." Arya left at dawn. She did not make a speech or a scene. She walked down to a ship that had a hull clean like the curve of a blade, and the men aboard her watched the girl with the long face and the short hair and did not know they would be telling their sons about this without knowing why for the rest of their lives. Sansa stood at the tower's edge and watched the sail climb and then catch and then billow out like a story someone had finally dared to write. She did not wave. Arya did not look back. The sea took the ship the way it takes everything in the end, with indifference and with tenderness. The Vale received Jon with skies so clean, he could see the bare bones of the mountains through them. Robin Arryn, who had learned how to stand upright and not lean always, smiled a great deal, as if he had discovered that the trick to being a lord was posture. Lord Royce spoke for him where he needed speaking for, and for the rest Robin did well with a shallow bowing and a thinner appetite for sweet milk. The Eyrie held cold like a jewel holds light. Jon slept there out of stubbornness and woke with frost in his teeth. He sat at a table and watched a round-cheeked boy from the mountain clan speak about a path that had caved in and killed 3 men. He watched a woman with a scar across her throat who asked for a place in one of the Vale's towns because her sheep had been stolen by men whose names she didn't know. Royce promised her she could have worked there if she liked. When Jon rode down the mountain on a gray mule because the mule had decided it loved him and refused to go forward unless he was on its back, he thought, "There is more peace in being known by a mule than by 1,000 men." In the Riverlands, the ruins were fresh scars made pink by rain. Jon stopped at the twins, which were no longer twins. One had a top half where stones looked for each other and could not find their mates. Edmure Tully came to meet him with a flagon and a baby on his shoulder. "You cannot refuse godfathership," Edmure said, and the baby looked at Jon and punched the air and cried from effort, which made Ghost put his head on one side and whine, which made the baby laugh, which made Edmure look as if he had been made king of a country made entirely of babies. Jon agreed to be godfather and poured river water over the child's forehead and muttered a prayer that was remembered for its honesty. He listened to the river lords, who had complaints he did not blame them for. A group of former Sellswords had taken to the road and were calling themselves guardians of the peace. They had a habit of keeping a tenth of eight ver they guarded. Jon sent riders to fetch them. He met them on a long flat stretch where geese walked in a line as if they were nobles going to court. Their leader was a man with one missing ear and a face like a story you read in dim light. Jon asked them what they thought peace was. The man said, "A thing you buy at a price." Jon said yes, but not the price you're asking. He offered them coin and a contract and a place in the Crownlands to build barracks. He offered them pension. The man who had lost an ear had lost it to a farmer with a billhook when the man had come to take a sack of barley as a tax for being alive. He looked down at his hands as if he didn't trust them to answer. Jon waited. Men will often set down weapons if you give them something else to hold, even if it is only a paper with a seal. He was on the road again when the word came, running faster than a raven could fly because gossip is a bird with more wings. There had been an attempt in the city, not by Davin Lannister, who had taken his disfavors and his reluctant agreements and gone west to tug his house back into a place that could stand, but by those who loved the past more than their children. It had the shape of a coup and the heart of a bluff. The conspirators were Westerland's men with debts in Old Town, Reach men who liked their own wine better than they liked the idea of a Stark counting their casks. A pair of angry knights from the Crownlands who were sure they deserved to be masters of something. They had thought to use the faith as cover, find a priest willing to bless a procession up the street of the sisters, open the king's gate at a signal. They had set a store of weapons under a butcher's shop and paid for the silence that never stays bought. A dog had found the salted beef, a boy had seen the swords, and the boy's mother had brought the rumor right to Sansa's door because the soup had been hot when Sansa said it would be. Sansa did not shout. She did not call for drum and trumpet. She sent the city watch to the king's gate with orders to let the men in if they came waving ribbons and singing prayers. She put Brienne on the steps of the Red Keep with half the king's guard and their white cloaks made whiter by the stone's grime. She had the culverts under the city sealed with iron bars in 4 places and left the 5th for those who were sure they were cleverer than any woman had ever been. When the conspiracy showed its face, it found itself invited in and then gently taken by the throat and told to sit. She had no use for subtlety when it only increased bloodshed. She had the ringleaders put in a room with a table and a pitcher of water and made them sit in silence for 3 days while their men were released to go home with warnings carved carefully into the air above their heads. At the end of 3 days, she entered and set a contract on the table and told the ringleaders to read, and what they read was this: exile to a place far from a city and a promise never to hold office again and a return of 1/3 of their wealth to the city for rebuilding. It was not mercy and it was not cruelty. It was making an example in a way that fed half the city and killed no one. It worked because Brienne stood behind her with her hands folded and because the men had not brought their wives. Men are always braver when there is no one to watch them cry. Tyrion watched all of it with the complicated relief of a man who had expected to have to invent a solution and instead got to watch someone else perform the trick. When it was over, he said, "You could have hanged them. It might have been simpler." "Simple is for weddings and funerals," Sansa said. "Governance is for breathing." Jon came back to King's Landing by the Rose Road. He was more tired than he knew. He smiled for a boy who brought him a bunch of flowers tied with a string and did not mind when they fell apart in his hand. When he rode through the city gates, the bell that had been rescued from a chapel spared by the dragons rang once, and people who had been taught that bells meant fire looked up and saw a man who looked like grief and like stubbornness, and some smiled because they had decided grief and stubbornness could be a kind of shelter. He found Sansa in the room with the view of the courtyard tree. The tree had grown in the months he had been gone. Its leaves were thicker. Its shadow fell across the paving stones and made a pattern like dragon's wings. She stood with her hands on the sill, the iron circlet on the table beside her. Her hair braided the northern way. He had never been so aware of how small their house was and how large their reach. "You did it," he said. "So did you," she said. They bent. "Not all. Enough." He stepped close enough to smell the soap she used, the one with a cedar scent. "I meant to ride for another 6 months. You could. You might." She looked away into the green. "But there is a tide. There is the moment when you can carry things without them slipping, and then after that you go home." He watched her, thinking, and recognized, with something like grief and like joy, that she could see farther in the straight line of politics than he could ever hope to. He could see men. She could see patterns. Together they could see the world as it was and not as it might like to pretend to be. In the hall that had once held a throne of melted swords and now held only people, Jon called the lords and ladies again. He spoke of what had happened since he left. He spoke of roads and grain and the promise of Dorne and the stubbornness of Ironborn and how the Vale's mule had preferred him. He spoke briefly because he always did. Then he looked at the ring of men and women and said, "The Regency is doing the work I dreamed it could do. I could keep a crown and keep riding and ask you all to pretend that king and regent are two different names for the same hand. You know me better. I am tired, and I do not want to turn what we have into something I have to hold so tightly I choke it." A murmur, an intake, the small movement of Brienne's jaw. Tyrion making himself still by force. "I will not be a king," he said, as if the words had been waiting for him since he was born. "We will write it. We will do it properly. But when the ink dries, I will be Jon Snow again, and Sansa Stark will be queen. Queen of the 6 kingdoms. The North will stand where it stands. It will be a sister, not a subject. I will ride with the free folk for a while and learn how not to turn into a stone sitting in a chair." He had expected arguments. He had thought Bronn would shout about contracts and the Iron Bank would send a man with bloodless lips and the Prince of Dorne would send a clever letter with a canary feather quill that said, "In essence, of course you would choose that." He had thought Gendry would look hurt and pretend not to be, that Edmure would immediately offer to hold something that did not need holding and drop it. He had thought Jon Royce would be stern and Robin Arryn would stand very upright and that would be their contribution. What he had not thought was that someone would make a sound like a prayer and that in it would be relief. It moved around the room like a draft and made the torches flicker. Sansa stood very still. She seemed, he would tell himself later when he learned how to put the feeling into words, to grow a second spine, a second line of strength running inside the first. Tyrion spoke first because he would always take that burden off of silence. "Then you need a plan," he said. "A document that says what it means to be a queen and what it means to be a sister kingdom and what it means to be a man who will not be a king and yet refuses to stop caring. We should write several copies. I recommend at least one in words the average man can read. I've always wondered what would happen if we tried that." Sansa's eyes met Jon's. In them was such a complex tangle of affection and exasperation that he wanted to rest his head against her shoulder, as he had not done since he was a boy and she was a girl and the world had not yet taken their first good thing and made them watch. Instead he bowed his head to her, she to him, an old thing made new by meaning. The weeks that followed were messy in the way births are messy. The lords who had thought to gain by flattery had to learn new speech. The ones who had thought to gain by fear had to learn they stood in a different kind of weather. The scribes. She lifted the parchment and used it as a pillow and put a cloak over Sansa's shoulders and stood at the door. Tyrion, who had taken to walking the hallways at odd hours because he had nowhere else to go at odd hours, stopped and looked and then remained where he was so that his footsteps would not disturb the breathing of a queen who had not yet learned how to sleep like one. The years would do what years do. They would make elders of them all if they were kind, ghosts of them if they were not. But in that moment, with the rain turning the city's ash into a paste that would harden under new stone, with the smell of yeast and damp wool and ink, Jon rode under a sky so clear it looked like a thing that could cut you if you weren't careful, and Sansa slept with a name list as a pillow, and the realm, against every sensible prediction, did not break. On the long road north of the wall, Jon found a girl with hair white as milk and eyes gray as a river stone. She had been born the day the bells rang. Her mother had died of fever, and her father had been a man with a heart like a cautionary song. Tormund picked her up by the scruff of her coat like a pup and held her out to Jon and said, "Here, you like them broken and difficult. She'll suit." Jon held her and listened to the way babies always sound like arguments against silence. He did not consider bringing her south. He did not consider abandoning her to men who had different ideas of kindness. He took her with him to a camp where the fires were small and the stew was hot, and he fed her lamb's milk made from oats and honey and water, and when she slept, she did it with her hand clutching his shirt as if she were already sure he would go away if she let go. He watched the way the wind moved in the tall grasses and thought, "This is the same wind that blew over King's Landing, and the same that lifted the gulls above Storm's End, and the same that lifts dew off Sunspear's pools. You can build a wall. You can write a charter. You cannot tell the wind whose house is whose." E.T. Okay her to the thens, and they raised eyebrows. He took her to Tormund's fire, and they argued and shared meat and made her a name. He sent a letter south with Sam's hand for Sansa because Sansa liked to know what names were given and why. He wrote, "We called her Nella, not for anyone, for the sound. Sometimes that is enough of a reason." Sansa wrote back that it was a good name because anyone could claim it or none could. She wrote, "The Prince of Dorne has sent engineers with a love of arches and fewer manners than I would like. The reach bent. Gendry married Ellen Cairn. She speaks more than he does, and it is very fortunate. The Lannisters pay on the first and do not complain, and it looks better on them than gold. Bronn has learned to laugh without it sounding like he might be sharpening a knife. Tyrion is always where he should not be and often where he is most needed. I have not found a master of whispers. I am learning to live without someone to put treachery in my ear. It is quieter. I sleep sometimes, and when I do not dream of bells." She did not write what she did not need to. He did not write what would hurt. Between them the realm stretched like cloth cut from a bolt none of them had chosen. They measured it and hemmed it, and most days it covered what needed covering. On the day the first stone of the new hall went up, Sansa stood and watched workmen lift and set again because the weight was wrong. She thought of her father's words about foundations and the way you could feel them under your feet even when you forgot they existed. She thought of Jon, north among the free folk, a man who had always wanted a world without corners and had learned to live in one made entirely of angles. She thought of Arya somewhere west of the maps, and of Bran at Winterfell, who sometimes wrote letters that were all sparse description of birds and weather and sometimes wrote nothing at all. She thought, "We are still here," and she put her hand on the stone. Years later a child would ask what that meant. This regency that turned into a queenship that had never been wanted as a queen wants a gown, but had been worn as a woman wears a duty, and someone would say, it meant bread and the way the light fell in the afternoon on a street that had a new gutter so the rain didn't fall into the house. It meant a contract that you could read without a maester. It meant that sometimes the men with the sharpest swords were asked to take off their boots and come back tomorrow. It meant that the North sent furs and took nothing it had not chosen. It meant a letter from the Iron Bank written in very good Westerosi that said, "We are invested in your stability," and Sansa writing back in the same careful hand that said, "I know." And in the far north, when the wind climbed out of the snow and found its long way south, it moved the leaves of the tree in Sansa's courtyard and lifted the fur on Ghost's back as he slept by a fire that had been made by a boy with a scar from a bolt that had not killed a king. In the long hall of Winterfell, a boy with hair the color of straw would stand up and tell a story about a queen who learned to love numbers, and an old woman would say softly, to herself more than to the boy, "I was there." In King's Landing, the bakers would stamp loaves with wolf and stag, and sometimes with a shape that looked like a girl's face turned toward the sea. In the Stormlands, there would be children who never spoke the word dragon because their stories were hammers and lovers with eyes like lightning. On Pike, men would grow old learning to want other things than what their fathers had shoved into their fists. In Dorne, the stones would hold new water, and every time the bells rang twice, people would look up and remember the day they did not run. When Jon came south again with a beard that the seabirds had tried to steal for nests and a girl with hair white as dawn who rode on his shoulders when she tired, He stood under the same hole in the Red Keep's roof and looked at the same spill of light. Sansa met him there. They did not embrace because some moments are too full of other people's eyes. But they smiled, and each smile held the others they had not had the chance to share. Then he knelt because Nella, solemn with the seriousness of children who learn that adults can be happy, had dropped a carved bird that Tormund had whittled for her, and you do not wait to pick up a child's bird. He put it back in her hand and she patted his hair and said, "Up," as if she had never said another word in her life. He rose. Sansa said, "Welcome home," as if she might be talking to the city and to the wind as well as to him. He said, "Thank you," as if he were talking to bread and to a sword and to a long stretch of road. Behind them the hall longed for a throne it did not need. Before them the world did what the world always does when people who did not ask to be its rulers ask it to be kind. Considered. It hesitated. It gave in a little. It remembered its own hunger, and it kept turning.